The shift at Arkham Field Psychiatric Hospital was always a negotiation with the dark. You traded several hours of your wakefulness for a heavy silence. A silence broken only by the occasional moan from a locked room or the metallic clatter of the drug trolley. That night, I was the sole resident doctor on duty. 3 floors of decay and lost minds were mine to manage, alone. I was in the break room, a small space painted a sickly yellow, trying to swallow a gulp of lukewarm, sludgy coffee. The wall clock read 3 a.m., the devil's hour, the time when the veil between exhaustion and lucidity is at its thinnest. Outside, the hospital was shrouded in a near-absolute silence. Only the wind whistled through the rattling window frames and the flickering fluorescent lights in the corridor, casting dancing shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. And then, it came. A scream tore through the night. This wasn't the drawn-out wail of patient 4B who believed his skin was on fire. This wasn't the whimpering cry of the woman in Ward C. This scream was short, sharp, and contained an absolute primal horror. It fractured in someone's throat and was abruptly cut off, as if a hand had muffled their mouth mid-shout. It came from the administrative office wing. My coffee cup fell from my hand, shattering on the floor, but I barely heard it. My heart slammed hard against my ribs, then began to accelerate. I grabbed the master key ring from the table. The main keys. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely as I stepped out. The flickering lights now seemed to mock me. The thick smell of disinfectant couldn't conceal the building's old, musty odor. Every step I took echoed strangely. I had a distinct feeling of being watched. I passed the nurse's station. It was empty. The night nurse, Brenda, was supposed to be there. Perhaps she heard it too and had gone to check. I tried to calm myself with that thought. I turned into the hallway leading to the offices. It was darker here. The emergency lights had been out for weeks and no one had bothered to fix them. I had to use the faint light from my phone to see the way. Dr. Miller's office, the chief of staff, was at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. A narrow slit of light spilled out onto the floor. He shouldn't have been here. He had gone home hours ago. "Dr. Miller," I called out, my voice hoarse. No reply. I pushed the door open. The air in the room was heavy and strangely warm. The smell of copper and iron hit my nostrils immediately. It was the smell of blood. Dr. Miller was slumped over his desk. His papers were drenched in the dark fluid. His throat, or where his throat should have been, was a deep, brutal gash. His eyes were wide open, staring at me, reflecting the faint light from my phone. He was dead, savagely murdered. I stumbled back, hitting the door frame. My stomach clenched. I covered my mouth to suppress a gasp. That's when I heard it. A low growl. It came from the dark corner of the room beside the filing cabinet. I was not alone. A massive figure slowly rose from the shadows. It was a man, but he didn't look human. He wore only tattered patient pants. His body was taut with coiled muscle, covered in old and new scars. But the most terrifying thing was his face. It was contorted by a pure primal rage. I recognized him. This was a patient from the maximum security ward, an area I rarely went to. His name was Kane, or at least that's what he called himself. His file said he had murdered his entire family with his bare hands before being caught. How did he get out of his cell? In his hand, he was clutching something. It wasn't a surgical knife. It was a shard of razor-sharp glass, seemingly honed from the bottom of a soda bottle, wrapped in cloth at one end. Dr. Miller's blood was still dripping from the point. We stared at each other for a moment that stretched into eternity. I could see his chest heaving. He was wheezing through his clenched teeth, creating a sound like bellows. I slowly lowered my hand, trying to reach for the phone in my scrub pocket. I needed to call security. He saw the movement. He roared an inhuman sound and lunged at me. I didn't have time to scream. I only managed to raise my hands to cover my face. He was too fast. His massive arms slammed me against the wall. My head hit the plaster, blurring my vision. Pain exploded behind my eyes. I tried to push him away, but he was strong as a bear. The overpowering smell of body odor and metallic blood engulfed me. He raised the glass shard. The light from the hallway caught it, making it glitter menacingly. I closed my eyes, bracing for the final pain. But he didn't stab me. He threw the glass shard aside. He snarled something, and then he used his fingernails. They were long and filthy, hard as rock. He raked them across my face. It was a tearing pain I had never imagined. I felt my skin and flesh rip. Hot blood poured into my eyes, nearly blinding me. I screamed, finally finding my voice. I gathered all my strength and kicked out hard at him. I heard a slight crack and he roared in pain. His grip loosened for a second. I slid to the floor, scrambling backward into the corridor, my own blood streaming down my face and neck. I couldn't see clearly. Everything was a red mess in shadows. He followed me, his steps hobbled by my kick. He was an unstoppable predator. "Brenda," I tried to yell. "Security!" I crawled toward the nurse's station, hoping to reach the red alarm button on the wall. Just a little further, Kane grabbed my ankle. His grip was an iron shackle. He pulled me back. I clung to the floor, my fingernails scraping the tiles. "Time for bed, doctor," he whispered, his voice horribly raspy. He flipped me over. I looked directly into his insane eyes. There was nothing there but emptiness. He raised both hands, ready to finish me off. "Stop," another voice, sharp and authoritative. The beam of a powerful flashlight shone directly into Kane's face, forcing him to squint and raise a hand to shield himself. 2 security guards, massive and dressed in black uniforms, stood at the end of the corridor. They had heard my scream. They held active tasers which were crackling in the air. "Let him go, Kane," one of them said. Kane growled, looking at them, then back at me. He was calculating. I said, "Let him go." The guards advanced. Kane knew he couldn't fight both of them, especially while injured. He let out one last frustrated roar, a bellow of defeat, and shoved me away. Then he turned and ran. He didn't run toward the guards. He ran toward the large window at the end of the hall. "Don't!" a guard yelled. But Kane didn't stop. He crashed straight through the glass pane. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the hospital. Then silence, only the wind whistling through the hole in the wall. I lay on the floor, panting, blood and tears mixing. One of the guards knelt beside me. "Damn it, doctor," he said. "Your face." I raised my hand to my cheek. It was wet and slick. I no longer felt the pain, only a cold numbness. They found Kane the next morning in an alley 3 blocks away. He had bled out from the cuts sustained from the window. They also found Brenda, the night nurse. She was stashed in a janitor's closet, her throat cut just like Dr. Miller's. Kane had killed her first, using her keys to unlock Miller's office. I survived. Arkham Fields Hospital was closed 6 months later, following an investigation into severe security violations. I never went back to psychiatry. I can't be in a quiet room for too long. I can't stand flickering lights. And every morning when I look in the mirror, I see the scars. 3 pale white streaks running from my temple down to my chin. They are a constant reminder of that night, a reminder that sometimes the darkness you are trying to treat is staring right back at you. And it's waiting to be set free. I had never believed in haunted places. As a real estate valuation engineer specializing in hazardous structures, I had spent a decade wandering through decaying buildings, from abandoned steel mills in the Rust Belt to crumbling asylums in remote areas. To me, an empty building was just a combination of fractured concrete, rust, and potential investment opportunities. The Blackwood Sanitarium was no different, or so I thought when I took the file. Deep in the Cascade Mountains, 30 miles from the nearest highway, Blackwood had been closed in the late 80s after a series of lawsuits concerning patient abuse. The record said it was completely derelict. My client, a resort development corporation, wanted to know if the main structure was salvageable or required complete demolition. I arrived at 4 p.m. The winter sky was a heavy, leaden gray, promising an incoming snowstorm. The main building loomed like a granite beast, its windows like black sockets staring down into the valley. I parked my truck in front of the rusted main gate, grabbing my powerful flashlight, recorder, and clipboard. The air inside was colder than the outside. It smelled of rotting paper, damp plaster, and something else. A pungent, sweet odor of industrial cleaning chemicals. This was strange. That smell usually evaporates after a few months, not a few decades. I started my work from the top floor, moving downward. The upper floors were as expected. Peeling paint, collapsed ceilings due to water damage, rusted, abandoned wheelchairs lining the long, echoing corridors. I took notes on the condition of the support beams and photographed the graffiti-covered walls. Nothing unusual until I reached the ground floor. As I passed the old administration wing, I noticed the floor was cleaner. Less dust, no debris from the ceiling. Traces in the thin layer of dust suggested recent traffic. Long drag marks as if heavy equipment had been moved. I told myself that perhaps trespassers or local kids had turned the place into a hangout. But the wheel marks were too straight, too purposeful. The sun quickly set behind the peaks and the building plunged into darkness. I switched on my high-powered flashlight, the beam sweeping across the endless corridors. I decided to check the basement before leaving. That was where the heating system and the building's foundation were located, critical elements for my report. The door leading to the basement should have been welded shut according to safety regulations, but the lock had been cut clean, the cut mark fresh and shiny. I pushed the door. It opened surprisingly easily, the hinges freshly oiled. A blast of warm air wafted up from below, carrying a strong smell of antiseptic, overpowering the mildew. I descended the concrete stairs. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the narrow space. At the bottom, I saw the impossible. The basement corridor was not dark. Fluorescent light strips on the ceiling hummed softly, illuminating a hall painted a clinical white. The vinyl-tiled floor was spotlessly clean. This was not the ruin of an abandoned asylum. This was an active facility. Common sense told me to turn back immediately, get in my truck, and leave. But a deadly curiosity kept me rooted. I needed to know who was here, and why they were using electricity from a grid that should have been cut. I switched off my flashlight and moved cautiously, hugging the wall. I heard a sound from the end of the corridor. Not machinery, but a groan. It was deep, wet, and unlike any human sound I had ever heard. It sounded like a badly wounded animal trying to breathe. I approached a door with a reinforced wire mesh observation window. I peered inside. The room was like a makeshift surgical theater. A stainless steel operating table was in the center, surrounded by modern medical equipment with screens blinking vital signs. But what was on the table was what froze my blood. It was a man, or what had once been a man. He was naked, his skin waxy pale. His body was crisscrossed with crude surgical scars, some still oozing fresh blood. But the most horrifying thing was his head. A section of the skull had been removed, replaced by a metal device implanted directly into the brain, with wires running down his neck and spine. He was awake. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely vacant, devoid of any human recognition, containing only pain and primal rage. He was struggling against the leather restraints, his muscles twitching unnaturally, powerfully enough that I could hear the leather straps squeak. I backed away, my stomach turning with horror. These weren't squatters. This was a large-scale, expensive, and completely illegal operation. Suddenly, a piercing alarm tore through the silence. Red lights began flashing along the corridor. I had triggered some kind of motion sensor. From the far end of the hall, heavy metal doors began to open with a hydraulic hiss. I heard the sound of pounding footsteps, but they weren't the sound of security boots. They were bare, heavy, uneven footsteps. I turned and ran back toward the stairs. Behind me, the growling intensified, no longer moans but insane screams. I glanced over my shoulder. 3 patients were charging toward me. They were like the creature in the operating room, deformed by brutal surgeries. One had a grotesquely swollen right arm, hypertrophied muscle mass tearing through the skin. Another had his face covered by a type of metal mask bolted directly to his jawbone. They moved with incredible speed, unconcerned with slamming into walls or falling. They only charged forward. I scrambled up the stairs, gasping for breath. A cold, steel-hard hand clamped onto my ankle. I fell face first onto the concrete steps, tasting blood in my mouth. I turned and kicked hard at the face of the one holding me. He didn't flinch, his vacant eyes staring right through me. He felt no pain. I kicked again, the heel of my work boot smashing into the implant on his head. There was a crack of breaking plastic and metal. He convulsed violently and released his grip. I scrambled up and kept running. I burst through the door leading to the ground floor and slammed it shut, sliding the bolt just as a heavy impact struck it from the other side. The old wooden door rattled violently. It wouldn't hold for long. I ran through the main hall, heading toward the main entrance. My truck's headlights were still shining outside, a beacon of safety. But as I neared the door, I saw figures outside. Men in black tactical gear, armed with military-style weapons. They weren't police. They were the cleanup crew. I skidded to a stop on the dusty floor. I couldn't go out the front way. I needed another exit. Diving back into the building's shadows, I headed for the old kitchen in the east wing. I remembered the blueprints. There was a delivery entrance there. The pounding on the basement door had stopped. That was worse. It meant they had found another way out, or the security team had released them to hunt me down. I moved in the darkness, not daring to use my flashlight. The footsteps of the creatures echoed throughout the building, their growling and wheezing seemingly coming from every direction. They were hunting, and their sense of smell seemed sharper than a normal human's. I reached the kitchen. The smell of rusted metal and old grease was strong. The exit was at the far end, behind the massive industrial stoves. I heard a sound right next to me. One of them was squatting on a prep table. It stared at me. This creature was terrifyingly thin, its limbs abnormally long, perhaps surgically elongated. It tilted its head, observing me like an interesting insect before banging its sharpened teeth. It lunged. I grabbed a nearby heavy metal baking tray and swung it hard. The blow connected mid-air, knocking it sideways into a pile of old pots and pans. The deafening clang of metal was sure to draw the others. I ran to the back door. It was secured with a new chain. I pulled the bolt cutters from my tool belt. Thank God I always carried them on surveys. My hands were shaking violently as I tried to clamp the jaws around the link. Pounding footsteps approached the kitchen. I gritted my teeth, putting all my strength into the cutter handles. The chain snapped with a sharp clink. I kicked the door open and scrambled outside. The cold mountain air hit my face like a slap, bringing me back to my senses. I was at the back of the building, near the dense forest surrounding the grounds. I dared not run toward my truck. They would be waiting for me there. I plunged straight into the woods, the snow beginning to fall thickly, blurring visibility. I ran until my lungs were on fire and my legs were numb. I heard the barking of dogs behind me, the roar of ATV engines. They were in pursuit. I slid down a ravine, tumbling through thorny bushes that tore at my clothes and skin. I lay still at the bottom, covering myself with mulch and snow, trying to control my ragged breathing. The barking dogs reached the edge of the ravine, then stopped. I heard human voices, short, tense commands. After an eternity, they retreated. Perhaps the snowstorm had covered my tracks, or they assumed I would freeze to death in the woods. I walked through that entire night. I don't remember much of the journey, just the bone-chilling cold, and the fear that every tree shadow was one of those mutated patients waiting. I reached a dilapidated gas station on the highway just as dawn broke. The night attendant looked at me as if I were a ghost. I must have looked terrible, clothes ripped, face covered in dried blood and mud. The local police arrived. I told them everything. About the labs, the modified men, the armed team. The sheriff, a tired middle-aged man, took down all the notes with a professional yet skeptical expression. They organized a raid on Blackwood 2 days later. They found nothing. The official report said the building was completely empty. No electricity, no lab, no equipment, just dust and decay. They suggested that perhaps I had stumbled upon a meth lab and suffered hallucinations from stress and dehydration. But I know what I saw. I know that smell of antiseptic. I know the feeling of that cold hand gripping my leg. Sometimes I still check online urban exploration forums. Occasionally there are rumors of missing hikers near the Cascade area, of strange screams echoing from the valleys at night. I quit my job. I moved to a big city where there is never total silence, where the streetlights are always on. I never go into old buildings anymore, but every time I smell industrial cleaning solution, I find myself back in that basement, staring into the bloodshot, vacant eyes of something that used to be human. And I wonder what they are building in the darkness now, and when they will be finished. The Beacon Ridge Mental Health Institute sat atop a hill, overlooking a dreary little town most people just drove through. It didn't look like a hospital. It looked like an expensive private university, with ivy-covered red brick walls and perfectly manicured lawns. This was where the wealthy sent their embarrassing family secrets, and I was one of those secrets. My file read generalized anxiety disorder and acute paranoia. To the outside world, that meant I was broken. To me, it meant I noticed the things others missed. I saw the tiny cracks in the perfect facade, I heard the silence that lasted too long in a conversation. And at Beacon Ridge, I heard everything. The man in charge of my treatment was Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was perfection clothed in human skin. He walked without a sound. He wore tailored suits, his salt and pepper hair always impeccably combed. But his real weapon was his voice. It was deep, soothing, and filled with empathy. When he talked to you, you felt like you were the only person in the world. He listened to my paranoia not like a doctor, but like a confessor. He nodded at the right moments, asked the right questions. He was the only one who made me feel safe. "We are not trying to extinguish your fear, Thomas," he once said during a session. "We are trying to understand its language. Your fear is trying to tell you something." In that moment, I believed him. The first to die was Julia. Julia was a young girl with perpetually frightened eyes who believed insects were crawling under her skin. She had been here 3 months and had started making progress. She had begun to laugh during group therapy. I had watched Finch work with her. He had a near-saintly patience. That morning, they found her in her bed. The nurses said it was suicide, an overdose of sleeping pills, a tragic but not uncommon end in a place like this. The hospital sank into a funereal silence. But I knew something was wrong. I knew Julia. I had talked to her in the common room. She was terrified of taking her medication. She believed the pills were how the insects got in. Every night she had to be supervised, sometimes coerced into swallowing each tablet. Someone so phobic of medication would never choose that method to end things. I took my suspicion to Dr. Finch. I expected him to dismiss it. Instead, he listened intently. He nodded. His deep blue eyes locked onto mine. "That is a very acute observation, Thomas," he said, his voice still velvety smooth. "And it's completely understandable. Your mind is trained to find patterns, to connect unrelated dots. You see a tragedy, and your paranoia instantly tries to turn it into a conspiracy. That's how your brain protects you from the chaos of pain." He explained it perfectly. He took my fear and reflected it back to me, wrapped in therapeutic language. He made me feel as if my suspicion was the very symptom of my illness. "I think we need to adjust your dosage a little," he concluded. "Not as an order, but as a reasonable suggestion. Just to help you through this shock," I agreed. And that night, I started feeling fuzzier. The second was Mr. Harrison. He was an elderly banking magnate who had lost his mind after the death of his wife. His illness was physical. His heart was weak. They said he passed away in his sleep. Heart failure, natural causes, a gentle death. But the night before, I had woken up at 2 a.m. The thirst from the new medication had dried my throat. I went to the nurse's station for water. The corridor was dark and quiet. As I passed Mr. Harrison's room, I saw Dr. Finch stepping out of it. It was odd. Finch never worked that late. Finch nodded to me, a slight, sympathetic smile on his face. "A restless night, Thomas," he murmured. "Mr. Harrison, too. I just brought him a glass of water." He brushed past me, carrying the scent of expensive aftershave. But Mr. Harrison never drank water after 10 p.m. He suffered from nocturia and always complained about having to wake up. The next day, he was dead. My paranoia was no longer a symptom. It was a compass, and every needle was pointing at Dr. Finch. He was there. He was always there, like a stage director in the wings, quietly orchestrating every tragedy. He was too perfect. His calmness was not empathy. It was emptiness. I had to be lucid. That evening, when the nurse brought me my small cup of pills, I kept the blue capsule under my tongue. The bitter chemical taste of the gelatin shell dissolved. I swallowed, pretending to take it. When the nurse turned away, I spat the pill into a small piece of tissue and hid it under my mattress. It was the first night in weeks I slept without sinking into a fog. The next morning, the world was agonizingly sharp. I kept up my act. I acted drowsy. I spoke slowly. I became the patient Finch wanted me to be, a case nearly cured yet still vulnerable. In therapy sessions, I spoke of hazy dreams. "The medication is working," he smiled. "You are beginning to accept." While I was supposed to be in my medicated rest period, I started observing. I took advantage of my feigned doziness to wander the halls. The nurses paid me no mind. I was just another ghost in the building. I needed proof. I needed to get into his office. The opportunity came on Thursday afternoon. during mandatory group therapy in the courtyard. I told the nurse I had a stomachache from the new pills and needed to use the restroom. They nodded, unconcerned. I didn't go to the restroom. I went to Finch's office. The door, as always, was unlocked. He believed in a trusting environment. His office was clinically neat. Books were perfectly aligned, not a single paper out of place. I went to the desk. The drawers were locked, but I wasn't looking for patient files. I was looking for something personal. On the bookshelf, tucked between the Psychoanalysis of Dreams and the DSM-5, was a black leather-bound notebook. It was unlabeled. I opened it. It wasn't a patient file. It was a diary. Finch's handwriting was elegant, precise, and chillingly cold. He wasn't writing about patients. He was writing about his art. I read about Julia. He described her fear of insects not in medical terms but in aesthetic ones. He wrote that he had freed her. He had given her a strong sedative in her sleep. Then, while she was unconscious, he had stuffed the sleeping pills down her throat, faking a suicide. A release from the perpetual itch, he wrote. I read about Mr. Harrison. He described the old man's weak heart as a technical inconvenience. Finch had administered a dose of digoxin, a heart medication, but in extremely high doses it causes cardiac arrest, a medically perfect death, untraceable, especially in someone with a history of heart trouble. He was granted the serenity he deserved, Finch noted. I flipped to the last page. It had my name. Thomas, below my name was a short paragraph. The perfect case. A study in paranoia. What happens when a mind that always seeks conspiracy stumbles upon a real one? His own paranoia will cover everything. His death will be a predictable tragedy. This week, a sound. I snapped the book shut. I turned around. Dr. Finch was standing in the doorway. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He just stood there, hands in the pockets of his white lab coat, looking at me with an academic curiosity. I always knew, he said, his voice still calm, that you were my most intelligent patient. Thomas. He stepped into the room and closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt clicking shut echoed. Do you know, he continued, walking to his desk, that here we are just patching up broken souls. We medicate, we talk, but we don't truly heal. We just make their pain manageable. He opened a small desk drawer I hadn't noticed. He took out a pre-filled syringe. The liquid inside was clear as water. He said, tapping the syringe, I offer a definitive cure. I am the only doctor here who truly heals. I bring peace. You're a murderer, I said, my voice dry. The leather-bound book felt heavy in my hand. That is a judgmental word. Finch smiled. He started circling the desk, advancing toward me. I prefer liberator. And now it is time to liberate you, Thomas. You have suffered enough. He held up the syringe. Potassium chloride, high dose. It will stop your heart almost instantly. With your chart, with your anxiety and panic, it will be recorded as sudden cardiac collapse. A tragic death. Perfect death. He was right in front of me. I could smell his aftershave. I couldn't fight him physically. He was taller and calm while I was shaking. I couldn't run. The door was locked. I had to use the only weapon I had. I had to use my own illness. As he brought the syringe toward my arm, I didn't back away. I looked over his shoulder into the empty corner of the room. I screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a roar from my chest. I pointed at the corner. He's on fire. He's burning. Fire. I wasn't talking to Finch. I was talking to my imaginary monster. The sudden, intense outburst made Finch hesitate. This was not the behavior he had predicted. He expected me to plead or to fight. He didn't expect a full-blown psychotic break. In that fraction of a second of hesitation, I moved. I didn't attack him. I ran for the window. It was a large bay-style window overlooking the lawn. I grabbed the heavy oak chair by Finch's desk and hurled it. I put all the strength of a paranoid man running from hell into it. The glass shattered in a deafening explosion of sound. The cold air rushed into the room. Fire! I screamed again through the hole in the window. Fire, first floor. Finch's office. I heard footsteps in the hall outside. The piercing fire alarm began to blare. Someone had heard the breaking glass and my screams. I turned back. Finch's face was no longer calm. It was contorted with fury. His perfection was broken. He knew he had lost his window of opportunity. He lunged at me, not with the syringe, but with his hands outstretched, aiming for my throat. But it was too late. The office door burst open. 2 large security guards rushed in. Instantly, Finch shifted. The madness vanished. He was back in character. "He's here," Finch gasped, pointing at me. "Help me, he's having a fit." He tried to commit suicide through the window. The guards looked at me, then at Finch, then at the broken window. They saw me, sweaty and panting. They saw Finch, the respected doctor, trying to calm his patient. "Take him to his room," Finch ordered. But as they grabbed me, I didn't resist. I held up the black leather-bound notebook. "He killed Julia," I said, my voice surprisingly clear and steady. "And Mr. Harrison, it's right here." Finch froze. He had forgotten the book. I threw the notebook toward one of the guards. "Read it," I said. The guard caught it. He looked at me, then at Finch. Doubt began to flicker in his eyes. I survived. The investigation uncovered everything. They exhumed the bodies of Julia and Mr. Harrison. They found traces of digoxin. Finch's diary was irrefutable evidence. I'm in a different place now. Less expensive, but more honest. They still say I'm paranoid. Maybe they are right. But I learned one thing at Beacon Ridge. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't actually trying to kill you. St. Dymphna's Hospital was not a place people came to heal. It was a place people came to be forgotten. Hidden behind old-growth New England pines, its gray brick walls seemed to swallow the sunlight. I came here with a singular purpose, to pose as a broken soul in order to expose the rot within. I was Arthur Hayes, a journalist, and I was hunting for evidence against the giant pharmaceutical corporation that was secretly testing their new drug here. My target was Unit C. It took me 3 weeks to convincingly play a man too broken to tie his own shoes, to be moved from the general ward to the isolated unit. Unit C was unlike the rest of the hospital. It was frighteningly clean, every surface gleaming under cold fluorescent lights. The air was thick with antiseptic and something else, a sweet chemical odor I couldn't place. The man in charge of this place was Dr. Eris Thorne. He had carefully groomed graying hair and deep blue eyes as placid as a frozen lake. When he spoke, his voice was low and melodic, as if rocking a child to sleep. He greeted me with a firm handshake. "Welcome to Unit C, Arthur," he said. "We're going to help you find yourself again." They started me on Ophion. That was the name of the drug. It came in a small white paper cup, a pale blue capsule. Initially, I didn't feel much, but after the 3rd day, everything began to change. It wasn't hallucinations. It was reality distorted. The light from the ceiling bulbs wasn't just bright. It was searing, penetrating my eyelids even when I shut them tight. The nurse's footsteps in the hall weren't footsteps. They were hammers pounding against my temples. My skin became agonizingly sensitive. The rough fabric of the patient gown rubbed against my arms like sandpaper. I tried to document everything in the small notebook I hid under my mattress. The side effects, the sensory shift, the escalating paranoia. I was no longer sure if the nurse's silence was due to discipline, or if they were whispering about me the second my back was turned. The other patients in Unit C were living ghosts. They didn't scream or thrash. That was the horrifying part. A woman named Eleanor just sat by the window all day, her eyes vacant, staring out at the pine forest. She didn't blink, even when a fly landed on her face. A younger man, perhaps my age, continuously scratched his neck with his fingernails, slowly, methodically, as if trying to peel off an extra layer of skin. His skin was red and weeping, but he seemed to feel no pain. They were Ophion's failures, souls that had been reset too thoroughly. Dr. Thorne began to pay attention to me. He called me into his office more frequently. His office was minimalist, with a dark landscape painting on the wall and a crystal model of a human brain on his desk. "You are reacting very well to Ophion." "Arthur," he said one afternoon, steepling his fingers, "most people sink into a passive state of receptivity by now. But you are still fighting. That is interesting." I felt a bead of cold sweat trace down my spine. "I just want to get better," I mumbled, fixing my eyes on the carpet. "Better is a relative concept," Thorne smiled. "We don't aim for better. We aim for efficiency. A brain unburdened by emotion, by fear. Imagine that clarity." He increased my dosage. My sense of paranoia was no longer a symptom. It was a defense mechanism. I knew I didn't have much time left. I needed the evidence and I had to get out. During the sparse recreation hour, when most patients were taken to a walled-in courtyard, I feigned a stomach ailment to return to my room. Instead of going to my room, I slipped into Thorne's office. The door was unlocked. He was too confident. I wasn't looking for patient files. I knew where they would be. In the bottom desk drawer, taped underneath, was a small, black external hard drive. I grabbed it. When I turned back, Thorne was standing in the doorway. He wasn't angry. He didn't yell. He just looked at me with an academic curiosity. "You are an outlier," he said, his voice level. "Your curiosity surpassed the chemical programming. Impressive." "You are killing these people," I said, my voice hoarse. The hard drive was searing my palm. "I am curing them, Arthur," Thorne corrected. "Their suffering is over. They have been freed from the burden of consciousness. It is a gift, and now it is time for you to receive yours." He pressed a button on the small pager clipped to his belt. 2 large orderlies appeared behind him almost instantly. They were not rushed. They advanced on me with the certainty of mechanics handling a faulty device. They dragged me into a treatment room. It was stark white, brightly lit. Dr. Thorne followed, a syringe in his hand. The liquid inside was not pale blue. It was clear as water. "This is a special dosage," Thorne explained, as if lecturing medical students. "It will expedite the process. There will be a brief discomfort as your neural pathways are recalibrated, but it will pass quickly." One orderly pinned my shoulder. The other pulled up my sleeve. I could smell the alcohol from the swab. Fear surged through me, sharp and icy. It didn't paralyze me. It focused me. Under the effect of Ophion, everything slowed down. I could see the tiny muscle fibers twitching on the orderly's arm holding me. I could hear Thorne's breathing, steady and calm. As the needle descended, I moved. I didn't fight like a hero. I fought like a cornered animal. I head-butted the orderly holding my shoulder, straight into his nose. There was a muffled cry of breaking cartilage. He stumbled back, clutching his face. The other orderly reached for me. I swung my hand, smashing the hard drive into his temple. It wasn't a strong blow, but it was enough to make him pause. I bolted out of the room. Thorne didn't try to stop me. He just stood there watching me with mild disappointment. "You are delaying the inevitable, Arthur," he called after me. The alarm started blaring, a shrieking, repetitive sound that made my teeth ache. I ran down the corridor. The other patients in the common room didn't even look up. Eleanor was still staring out the window. The man was still scratching his neck. I ran toward the only exit from Unit C, a thick gray steel door. It was locked. It required a keycard. I heard footsteps behind me. 2 security guards, distinct from the orderlies, were running towards me. They wore dark blue uniforms and carried batons. I was cornered. No way back. Beside me was a metal utility cart used for medical supplies. And on it was what I needed. A small green oxygen tank they approached, splitting up to flank me. "It's over, pal," one of them said. I grabbed the oxygen tank. It was heavier than I thought. As the first one swung his baton, I didn't try to dodge. I hurled the oxygen tank hard against the brick wall right next to his head. I didn't aim for him. I aimed for the valve. A deafening hiss erupted. The tank's valve snapped. Pure oxygen blasted out with tremendous force, creating a cloud of cold, white mist. The tank began to spin wildly on the floor, like an out-of-control snake, hitting the legs of the 2 guards and throwing them off balance. In the chaos, I saw Dr. Thorne walking toward me, still holding the syringe. I didn't run away from him. I ran towards him. I pushed him hard. The surprise made him stumble backward into the hissing oxygen tank. The cold pressurized gas jetted straight into his face. He shrieked, a brief choked sound as the cold burned his lungs. I didn't stop to look. I lunged for the steel door. One of the guards had dropped his set of keycards when he fell. I snatched them, swiping frantically across the reader. The door beeped and unlocked. I burst out, slamming the door shut behind me. I heard them pounding on the door from inside. I ran. I ran through the hospital's familiar corridors, my patient gown soaked in sweat and the orderly's nosebleed. I ran through the main lobby, where the night attendant was drowsing. She looked up at me, too shocked to react. I pushed open the front doors and plunged out into the cold New England night air. The air had never been so clean. The story was published. St. Dymphna's was shut down. Dr. Thorne, after recovering from the cold burns to his face and throat, is awaiting trial. The external hard drive contained everything. Test videos, death files, payments from the pharmaceutical giant. I survived. I won. But I lied when I told the doctors I had no lingering effects. I wake up every night drenched in sweat. Sometimes I can't stand the sunlight. It's too bright. And I can't be in a room that is too quiet. The silence is too loud, and occasionally when I'm tired or stressed, I get the sensation, a strange tingling itch just under my skin, as if something is trying to peel me off from the inside. Ophion is still there. Thorne took a piece of me, a piece I'll never get back. I exposed the monster, but I also made myself a cage for it.